of the show, let's look ahead to this coming weekend's UFC Fight Night, Hermansson versus Pyfer. Going down this Saturday, February 10th at the UFC Apex in Las Vegas, Nevada, headlined by two middleweights, Jack Hermansson and Joe Pyfer. Before we get to, I think we're going to do 4 of these main card fights. We're going to analyze and pick them. Are there any other fights or fighters on this card that you guys want to quickly spotlight for the listeners? Mark?
Yeah, I think it's a fairly interesting undercard, at least in terms of singular names. Daniel Marcos is on it, who's looked very good so far. He's fighting Aori Kilong. Lomalik Bunmei is on it, who has looked very good. She's fighting Bruna Brazil. It's just that, I feel like, at least in my opinion, we know how these fights are going to go. One that I do really like, though, is Jeremiah Wells versus Max Griffin. That's probably my favorite fight of the undercard. I actually like Max Griffin a lot as a dog in that fight. I think last I looked, he was like plus 160 or something along those lines. And I feel like he can just rely on his technique and be, obviously Wells is always a threat to knock anybody out with one punch, but I like Max Griffin in that fight. I'll be intrigued to see what happens there. And yeah, there's some other interesting ones. I'll toss it to Omar for a second, though.
Yeah, that's actually my favorite fight of the undercard is Max Griffin and Jeremiah Wells. I'm pretty interested in that fight. Devin Clark is also on this card against Marcin Prachnio. And from what I'm looking at his record, it might be time for a win for Devin Clark. It might be a good time to watch. You also got Trevin Giles on this card as well, who's also a decent fighter. I'm pretty excited to see how he makes out in this fight as well.
He's good.
And then Mark's boy is on this card.
Yeah,
you know what I mean.
I was gonna circle back to that. We in terms of this main card, there's a couple random fights on it. Ihor Potieria is fighting debuting fighter in Robert Bursek. I'm not even sure how you exactly say his last name, but Potieria is only 1-3 in the UFC, so we figured we won't give you a full breakdown for that one. And then same thing with the opener of Michael Johnson and Darius Flowers, with Flowers only being 0-1 thus far. But I will say I'm nervous for my boy Michael Johnson. He is the slight betting favorite, but Flowers throws absolute heat, and Michael Johnson can certainly be put out. So I hope he can avoid the hammers of Flowers in that fight and put on a technical performance and look good. But we'll see, because if he's losing to Darius Flowers, I think it's about that time.
Yeah, man. Okay, let us begin with a middleweight bout between Rodolfo Vieira and Armen Petrosyan. So, Petrosyan, Superman is his nickname. The 33-year-old out of Armenia, 9-2 as a pro with 6 knockouts, coming off back-to-back wins. Most recently, a UD over Christian Leroy Duncan. He is 3 for 4, or 3-1 thus far in the UFC after winning on Contender Series. Mark, start us off. Oh no, I'm sorry. Let me do Vieira. Rodolfo Vieira, the black belt hunter. He is the 34-year-old out of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. 9-2 as a pro, so dead even records. Opposite styles though. Rodolfo Vieira, the black belt hunter, lives up to his nickname with 9 of his wins ending by submission, and the other win that he has being a knockout win, which means none of his wins have gone the distance. So if he's winning, he's finishing. And he also is coming off of a submission win over Cody Brundage back in April. Mark, start us off. Give us your take, the odds, and your pick.
So the odds are very close, and the favorite is actually Vieira, which surprised me a bit. I thought it would be the other way, but Vieira is minus 120, and Petrosyan is just above even money. He is plus 105 as the underdog. 3 inches of height for Petrosyan, but 2 inches of reach for Vieira. So those sort of cancel each other out in a way. This one was supposed to happen a couple months back. I believe it was on a December card. Got nixed last minute. We get it here instead. And we already had talked about it then, so I'm not really going to say anything too different tonight than what I said when we previewed it the first time, which is that it really is a pure style clash type fight. Vieira needs to find his way inside the strikes of Petrosyan and get him to the mat where he will have a huge edge. And Petrosyan needs to keep it standing where he will have a huge edge at distance. So it's kind of that old school style clash type of fight. They're both really strong guys who have been good in the clinch, so that aspect of the fight could be interesting. It's certainly one that I could see going either way, but the thing that was what swayed me last time, which hasn't changed here, is the fact that Petrosyan did well against Caio Borralho. Yes, Borralho won that fight, but his game is significantly more blended and well-rounded than Vieira's is, and Petrosyan, as I said, was able to make him work hard in there. So I think he can do the same to Vieira. Granted, Vieira may only need one takedown, but I'm going to say that Petrosyan mostly keeps Vieira off him and picks him apart and wins himself a decision victory.
Omar.
Yeah, I'd agree. The stylistic matchup, I think, is definitely something you can't take for granted, especially because Vieira has such high-level jiu-jitsu, Petrosyan has such high-level kickboxing. But I trust the takedown defense of Petrosyan in this case, and I think as long as it doesn't go down in the ground, I think Vieira is going to have a rough night. And we've seen Vieira have rough nights, not only, in a fight in total, but also having to deal with his cardio as well. And while we haven't seen his cardio suffer as much as we did in the fluffy fight, I think if he spends an entire round trying to go for takedowns that he's not going to get, I think we might see a lot of a repeat of that later in the fight. So I'm going to go Petrosyan here. I like him in this fight. I think he gets a finish, but I think it happens late. So I'm going to go with a third round TKO.
I feel the same way, except for Vieira. I think he's going to do what he needs to do to get this fight where he needs it to be. I mean, it's kind of to me, it's a little bit of a coin toss, because you have a guy who's a knockout artist going up against a guy who's never been knocked out, and you have a guy who's a submission artist going up somebody who's never been submitted. So
that's fair.
I'm going to roll the dice. I'm going to say Vieira gives Petrosyan his first submission loss of his career. I'll go round 3. Nice. Okay, moving on to another middleweight bout here. UFC Fight Night Hermansson versus Pyfer. Brad Tavares taking on Gregory Rodrigues, or Hobocop, as we love to call him here on this little show. Brad Tavares, the 36-year-old fighting out of Hawaii, USA, 20-8 as a pro, with 7 finishes, 5 of those being knockouts, coming off of maybe the most impressive win of his career against Chris Weidman back in August. It was a UD, but it seemed like he could have gotten Weidman out of there if he was a little bit more ferocious. And he'll be taking on Gregory Hobocop Rodrigues this time, who is the 31-year-old out of Brazil. His record stands at 14-5 heading into this weekend, with 12 of his wins being finishes, 9 of those being knockouts. He's coming off of a nice knockout win over Dennis Tululin also back in August. Oh, that was on the same card. Excuse me. Their wins were on the same card. Both were on UFC 292, Sterling versus O'Malley on August 19th. Omar, start us off this time. Give us your take and your pick of Tavares versus Rodrigues.
You're muted, Omar.
You're muted.
I love Brad Tavares. I've always loved Brad Tavares. Been a big fan. Man's been around for a minute. Been around so long, he's fought Phil Baroni. Like, that's wow. How long the boy's been around. So, like, yeah. I'm a big fan. But this is one of those kind of fights where, like, I know what his vulnerabilities are, right? Like, we've seen time and time again the game of Brad Tavares, and no shade to Chris Weidman, but the Chris Weidman win, I don't think was a appropriate gauge of where Brad Tavares really is, I guess, in terms of his striking or how he can approach a fight overall. Chris Weidman was coming back from a devastating injury, injured his other leg in the like. There's a lot of things we can say about that Chris Weidman fight, but against somebody like Hobocop, who is not injured, who hits like he's trying to kill somebody with every punch, and somebody like Brad Tavares, who is unfortunately very susceptible to getting hit I cannot imagine he walks out of this not having been knocked out. And again, I love Brad Tavares, but this is just not the one for him. I can't imagine. So I'm gonna go with Hobocop here, and I think it happens early, Doc. I'm gonna go round 1 KO.
Wow.
I agree with Omar on this one. I think Hobocop presents an entirely different challenge than his last win over Chris Weidman. Tavares proved in that last outing to have tremendous leg kicks. I was like, oh, maybe I never realized that Tavares had such strong, heavy leg kicks. I don't think that's going to be as much of a factor in this one because I think Gregory Rodrigues is a human oak tree, and like Omar said, I think he hits like a Mack truck, and I think he's going to get Brad Tavares out of there. I'm going to go with Gregory Rodrigues by knockout. I'll say round 2. Mark?
Okay, the man you guys are picking is the pretty clear favorite. He is minus 250 on the betting lines. Brad is an even plus 200. 2 inches of height and 1 inch of reach for Gregory. And yeah, I like this fight a lot. You know, Brad has shown over the years that he can hang with nearly anyone. If there has been one knock on him, as Omar pointed out, it's that he can be put out. And he's fighting a man in Hobocop who knows how to put people out. So Rodrigues will be live as long as this fight goes. I am really curious to see it, though, because the mistake that others have made with Rodrigues is to swarm him or to wade in too aggressively. And Brad won't really do that. He's very good at maintaining his range and just working the strikes he wants to work without taking, you know, the risk of the phone booth style type of fight. Not to say he doesn't still get caught, because obviously we just talked about how he does. But I think that helps him at least a bit against Rodrigues. You know, he actually fights a bit similar to a guy we just talked about in Armen Petrosyan, who was able to edge Rodrigues when they fought. But on the other end of that, we have recently finally gotten to see the grappling chops from Rodrigues in his last fight, which we've always heard were amazing, and we finally saw, and they were friggin' amazing. So I'm curious if he goes to them here, but Brad historically is pretty impossible to take down. So that's another interesting aspect. So there's a lot of fun, you know, ways that this fight could potentially go. And I am a little bit torn, but I think Brad is just hitting that stage where he's starting to struggle a bit against guys who have that athleticism edge over him. And as you mentioned, like Chris didn't have that. A few of the other recent wins didn't have that. And I think Hobocop does have that. So I'm going to say that it's a close fight for a bit, but that it starts to swing. And I'll say Rodrigues gets him out of there late, round 3 TKO.
Okay, boys, we move now to the co-main event of this UFC Fight Night. Once again, going down at the UFC Apex in Las Vegas, Nevada. In the featherweight division, Dan Ige takes on Andre Fili. So here we go, Dan 50K Ige. He's earned that nickname based on his performance of the night, finishes that earned him extra cash in the UFC. He is the 32-year-old fighting out of Honolulu, Hawaii, USA. His record stands at 17 wins and 7 defeats, with 10 of his wins being by finish, with an even 5 knockouts and 5 submissions. And he's looking to get back in the win column after losing a unanimous decision loss to Bryce Mitchell back in September. And he'll be standing across from Andre Touchy Fili, the 33-year-old out of Sacramento, California. His record stands at 23-10 with 1 no contest, with 10 knockouts to his name, coming off of what was his 10th knockout against Lucas Almeida back in December. Omar, start us off this time. Give us your take and your pick of Ige versus Fili.
It's a big fight for Fili, man. And frankly, a really good matchup. There's a lot of questions here as to how this fight is going to go. I think the one thing that we know is both of these guys are going to be pretty mobile. I don't think we're going to see any flat feet at all. I think there's going to be movement in 100% of this fight. I think the big difference we might see are the kicks. Andre Fili is not shy using his hands and his feet. Ige tends to lean a lot more towards his hands. You know, he'll throw leg kicks here and there, but for the most part, he's pretty in love with using his hands more than anything. and Fili has a good reach. I would imagine, and again, I'm sure Mark will get into this part here, but I would imagine there's going to be a good bit of reach in the Fili department. Probably not like, who the hell did we talk about last week that's got a crazy ass 8-inch reach or whatever it was. It's probably not that crazy, but
Randy
I'm
Brown.
sure Fili's, Randy Brown, but I'm sure Fili's got a
I'll
good,
give it to you.
good reach here.
It is only 3, so nice little reach, but nothing crazy.
Right. But Fili's good, man. And I think the thing that I love to see about Fili is he seems like he's getting better. And Dan Ige is consistent, but his consistency has always led him to inconsistent results. And I think the only reason I'm leaning more towards Dan Ige is just because of his veteran experience, and I feel like he in spots like this, I think he could edge out a win. And it's not to say Fili's not a veteran because he's been in the game now for forever. But I just think Dan Ige's been in there with better guys that I think he'd be able to, like I said, edge out Andre Fili. I don't think he blows Andre Fili out of the water. I don't think it's even a dominant performance by any stretch of the imagination. But I do think when we look at the back of these rounds, I would have to imagine that Dan is going to be able to edge out 2 out of the 3. So I'll go with Dan Ige by decision. Wouldn't even be surprised if it ends up being a split, to be honest.
I'm similar to you in a certain sense, but I think, I think Andre Fili himself has not been the most consistent either. And I think, look, they seem to have similar win percentages in their career. But I'm going to go with the power being the difference for Dan Ige. Dan Ige, for a guy who only has 5 knockouts. In fact, look, Andre Fili, looking at the records now, has more knockouts. He has twice as many knockouts as 50K Dan Ige. But I think of Dan Ige as more of a power puncher. And I think that that's still true. So I'm going to go with Dan Ige by knockout. I'm going to say he gets Andre Fili out of there. I'll say in the 3rd round by knockout, Dan Ige. Mark?
That's crazy.
It's not that crazy. Andre Fili's been knocked out.
So Ige is favored. He's minus 175. Andre Fili is plus 145. So pretty close. Imagine maybe it would be even closer if it wasn't short notice for Fili. He is bigger and longer, 4 inches taller, 3 inches of reach for Andre. And I really, really wanted to come into this and trust the vibes that I'm getting and say this is the one where Andre Fili breaks through. He's much taller. He's got the reach edge. Ige's lost 4 out of 6. I've always felt like Dan Ige was maybe not quite as good as his ranking suggested. I've always felt like Andre Fili possesses the talent to be better than what he's shown us thus far. There was a lot of things where I was like, I think I'm going to pick Fili to break through here. I'm almost talking myself back into it right now, honestly. But I looked at the opponents for each of them, specifically for Fili. And it's hard to deny that he has historically struggled with guys like Dan Ige, guys who are quick, powerful punchers. Michael Johnson, loss. Sadiq Yusuf, loss. Joe Anderson Britu, loss. Nathaniel Wood, loss. These guys beat him. It's the longer volume striker types that Fili shines more against. Almeida in his last fight, Bill Algeo, Charles Jourdain, Miles Jury. Those types of guys he does well. The quicker power punchers have historically given him trouble. So I don't know. As much as I'm having this feeling about Fili here, I'm just going to trust the evidence and admit that he has a hard time with this style. If I'm Fili, I think I show takedowns early in this fight. The more that he can mix it up and the more that he can discourage Ige from planting and throwing big shots, I think the better off he'll be. Not to say that Ige is like some plotting power puncher who's always loading up, because he's definitely not. But I think a fight that takes place everywhere and not knowing, what phase of the fight they're in, I think that type of fight helps Fili's chances. But Fili coming in on short notice, the historical evidence, like I said, I will go with Dan Ige to edge it, and I'll actually even say that it is a split decision.
Oh, wow. Okay. All right, boys, let's go to the main event of the evening for what will be this coming Saturday evening. UFC Fight Night, Hermansson versus Pyfer going down at the UFC Apex in Las Vegas, Nevada. Headlined by Jack Hermansson and Joe Pyfer. So here we go. Jack the Joker Hermansson, the 35-year-old out of Sweden. His record stands at a very impressive 23-8 with 11 knockouts and 6 submission victories. Looking to get back in the win column after a knockout loss at the hands of Roman Dolidze back in December of 2022. So a bit of a long layoff for Mr. Hermansson. And he's coming back against another knockout artist in Joe Body Bags Pyfer, the 27-year-old out of Medea, or is it Medea or Media, Pennsylvania? I don't know. 12-2 as a pro, with only one of his 12 wins going the distance, 3 submission victories and 8 knockout victories for Pyfer. And he's going to be riding a wave of confidence, riding a 5-fight pro win streak coming into this Saturday night. And after winning on Contender Series, he is now 3-0 in the UFC. All 3 are finishes inside of 2 rounds. Mark, start us off this time with the odds, your take, and your pick of Hermansson versus Pyfer.
So the unproven fighter here, Joe Pyfer, is a minus 260 favorite in this fight. Jack Hermansson is plus 210. 1 inch of height for Pyfer, but 2.5 inches of reach for Hermansson. And yeah, it's very hard to pick against Joe Pyfer right now, man. He's looked fantastic. He has shown us that he's skilled everywhere. I think it's going to have to be someone pretty high level across from him for me to be comfortable going against him. And I'm just not sure that Hermansson is quite high enough. And don't get me wrong, he's a great litmus test because he's also a guy that has shown us a lot everywhere in different fights. You know, he'll have one fight where he shows off that heavy top game. Then he'll tap Kelvin in another fight. Then he'll outstrike Chris Curtis in another fight. Like, he's got skills. He can do it everywhere. But as unproven as Joe Pyfer is against the top level, I'm just not sure that Hermansson's skills exceed what Joe Pyfer brings. You know, Joe Pyfer is a fucking tank. He is an athlete. He throws nukes in there. He's going to look to walk Jack down from the bell. And, you know, maybe Jack can thwart that. It's very possible that Joe has to adapt in this fight in ways that he hasn't had to before. But I like the power edge that he has. I think he's going to be faster, and he may even have the grappling edge also. You know, he's been a beast in these competitions that he's been doing. He beat Mearshart, I'm pretty sure, in a grappling competition. So I think he's going to be a problem for Hermansson. I do worry a little bit about what the cardio looks like over 25 minutes just because we haven't seen it. But, you know, maybe it'll be totally fine. It's also been over a year since Hermansson fought, so a little bit of questions on that side too in terms of the activity. But yeah, I'm going to go all in on Pyfer and say he gets a finish here and really just announces himself. Round 3, TKO, Joe Pyfer.
Dude, I agree with you. And you made all the points that I was not going to make and made them better than I ever would have. But just to say something about it, I do think Pyfer, his power and his size is scary. Do you see him listed at 6'1" or 6'2"?
I don't even, I just write the difference. I don't even write the things. But hold on, I'll tell you what I saw.
I see him on Sherdog. He's listed at 6'1", and I was like, damn, I think of him as a giant. Much taller than 6'1", but he's a big 6'1" if he's 6'1".
I also thought he was much bigger than Hermansson, so I'm actually surprised Hermansson has any kind of...
Tapology has him at 6'2", and they have Hermansson at 6'1".
Okay. So he's somewhere around there. Anyhow, I see Pyfer getting Hermansson out of there. I'm going to say the knockout is going to come... I'm going to say the knockout is going to come in the second round for Mr. Pyfer. Omar.
It is very difficult to pick against Joe Pyfer at this point. I will say I don't think he knocks him out. I think he relies on his grappling at this point. there's one thing I took away from Joe Pyfer in his last fight. It just seemed like he was trying to prove a point, and I don't think he got to prove it the way he wanted to, and I think he's going to try to do that again in this fight. So I think he's going to go for some takedowns here. I think he hasn't really needed to in his last fights. I don't think he probably won't need to in this fight either, but I think he will. And I think he's going to go for a submission here, and I think he'll end up with one. So I'm going to go with a round 1 submission for Joe Pyfer.
Wow.
Round 1 sub? Oh my goodness. Put the